The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Gender divisions, the institution of marriage, and family structure are just some of the areas greatly affected by social change. How has the advancement of the woman's liberation movement caused society and the workplace to adapt its rules of etiquette? And how do manners fit into the evolution of the nuclear family? Today, we discuss etiquette and social change in the 21st century with Judith Martin, also known by her pen name, Miss Manners, and now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Judith Martin, also known as Ms. Manners. Welcome to Policy Watch for a continuation of our earlier conversation.
Thank you.
It's really a delight that you could join us. As a syndicated columnist and an author of many best-selling books, including the two that I have sitting here, the one I wanted to mention to our audience, Star-Spangled Manners, because I just read it this weekend, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful journey from our founding. So wonderful to have you here. In that book especially, you talk about how manners change with social change. And I'd like to spend this program talking about two probably related social changes, and that is the changing role of women in our society. Some people call it the women's movement or women's lib. Some people call it women going to work or mothers going to work. But that whole change in the way women see themselves and how they behave. And then connected to that, the almost simultaneous changes in family structures. Because I think for at least us men, it's been very complicated and quite difficult. And
for women too.
For women too, exactly. But you see, one aspect of these changes is men no longer feel comfortable speaking for women. So we wait till the woman says something. Let's start with the world of work. Most of us now, well, not most of us, but many of us are in situations where there are men and women together in the same office, in the same factory, out on the same job. Should we think that there are differences between the men and women in the office, on the shop floor?
No, it's a very counterintuitive principle which is very hard to grasp, which is that gender is not a factor in the workplace. It is in social life, but it is not in the workplace. And so rank is the factor in the workplace. And so if you're going to make a big fuss of being gallant to someone, probably should be your boss and not necessarily anybody who happens to be a woman. Because people there are there in professional capacity. And it's hard for people to grasp this, I'm afraid.
You thought that Justice O'Connor could have been called Madam Justice and not just Justice.
The other justices were called Mr. Justice. And I thought that was rather dignified. And then they went into a panic. Well, what are we going to do when we have a woman? And so they said, well, we just have to drop it altogether. I think this was a mistake. It's interesting that the titles of dignity for men have remained the same for centuries, Mr. and Sir, whereas the ones for women all get this sort of dirty connotation. Mistress was the equivalent of Mr. It's from which both Mrs. and Miss, and for that matter, Ms. are derived. Madam, tee-hee, got on a dirty connotation. But that's wrong. And I was very pleased that the first woman Secretary of State had herself addressed as Madam Secretary. And they could just as well have done that. But the equalizing process, unfortunately, has not been to extend dignity to everybody. It's been to subtract it from those who had it. So the office where the secretaries were women and were called by their first name, and the bosses were men and were called Mr., instead of calling them Mrs. or Miss in a dignified way, everybody's on the first name basis.
Boy, are they ever.
I know. I know, and it's this sort of pseudo friendship of the office, which is a farce and a burden for a lot of people.
I could almost deal with that. I can't deal with the fact when I call a complete stranger and I get that person's secretary, male or female, instead of saying, yes, Mr. Besheroff, or I'll leave that message, it's, sure, Doug, I'll be sure he gets the message.
Because people at best think, oh, that's friendly. But they're not your friends. Friendly manners are for your friends. And we have leveled it. There used to be those distinctions, and there would be a lovely moment when you would say, you know, now that we're friends, please call me by my first name. But we've sort of leveled all that, and everybody assumes the privileges of friendship immediately.
Now, it is quite lovely, isn't it, though? The act of saying, please call me Doug, is really quite a lovely...
Exactly, and you lack that. But let me tell you, you can also say, please call me Mr. in the same tone of voice.
On the other hand, having said that, it does seem to me as if the willingness of complete strangers on the phone to call you Doug is also a sign that we're getting even more egalitarian as a society.
Well, there's a difference between being equal, and again, this is what America has struggled with in the beginning, being equal and being cheeky, being intimate with everybody. This is a country that the British sneered at us for our friendliness because they live on a little island where you got to get out of everybody's way. We had plenty of land, but you needed to make friends quickly because you were on the move. You needed to help other people, and American openness and friendliness is a wonderful thing. But at some point, it crossed the border into instant intimacy. And that's quite a different thing.
Going back to the office, and you've just said that there should be no differences in the office between men and women. Now, the American marriage rate continues to plummet. And there aren't that many places where people can meet other people. It used to be church, it used to be neighborhood, it used to be family, and we now spend so much time in the office or work, whatever work is a major place where we meet people. Now, can two people find each other at work, and if so, how?
They do all the time, but should they do it on office time? No. This is one of the, can we talk about a little bit about the larger problem here? I mean, that is a major problem, but there is a larger problem, which is the society had been set up with a gender division. Women run the household, and they run the social life, and they run philanthropic life. And men do the work that brings in the money to the family. When women were in great numbers and in high positions in the workplace, nobody took over the former job. And so you have no real social life. Philanthropy has struggled along in its pseudo business way, but not in the way when you had women doing the volunteer work. And child rearing has gone by the wayside. The answer is not to say, oh, that gender division was great, let's go back to it. The answer is, how do we restructure the society so that people can do both? Because, yes, there were the women who would have liked to work and were not able to, but there were also the men who would have liked to get to know their children before college graduation when they had to be introduced. And it was unfair to them, too.
But it does seem as if, and you mentioned this about child rearing, one trend in society has been a little bit more sharing husband and wife, father.
A little bit. It's a lot of sharing with hired professionals who are brought in to fill the gap, and even that is not a very satisfactory situation. The workday is not only long, but it is now supplemented with all this pseudo-social activity. And, you know, weekends and evenings and lunches and birthday parties and all that kind of stuff, which is properly in this private sphere, but it takes up the time of the workers that they might also otherwise spend in the private sphere.
So the company that was Rent a Wife for the wifely activities non-matrimonial is a very powerful thought.
Yes, but we still have not dealt with the problem of structuring the society so that people can have some mix of both professional and private life.
It doesn't look as if we're going in that direction.
Well, I mean, you hear the anguish of people who are expressing the problem, so one would like to believe that this will eventually produce a solution.
Yeah, I think longer life, and I'm not saying this is how it ought to be, but my observation is as people live longer and as their labor force years extend, there's just a greater tendency, and I bite my tongue as I say it, that the women take some time off and then go back thinking they have another 30 or 40 years of work.
That would be fine if they weren't penalized in the workplace, which basically they are. I mean, it's really not said. Yes, I mean, I think that's fine. I mean, I have nothing against women choosing not to work if they can afford it and want to. But the question is, there isn't a social structure that permits whatever mixture you want.
Surely, surely. Social structures.
Yes.
So we used to say that marriage was the time when people got together, to say that with some delicacy. But now cohabitation rates for young people, either of different sexes or the same sex, are extremely high. Something like 40 or 50% of all the young people who marry have cohabited first, either with the person they're marrying or someone else. And yet cohabitation seems different from marriage, otherwise it wouldn't be a separate status. How should we think about that status that's short of marriage, either the big think or the smaller etiquette questions of who are these people and when do they get invited to things, what's their role in our society?
Well, I mean, you have to struggle around to figure out what a couple is. I mean, you're talking about the social aspect.
Are we going to say,
but
depends on what a couple means? Is that
yeah.
what it works?
But I think why do they get married at all is the question. Well, to have a big wedding and to register at places and try to shake down their friends, I'm afraid, is often the answer.
Well, wait a minute. I can't let you go. So why do they have a big wedding besides shaking down their friends?
That's a very interesting question. I said that to my daughter once. I said, you know, when I was married, my name changed. I left my parents' house to go live with my husband. Everything about my life changed. And I said, nowadays, nothing changes. So why do they have the big weddings? And my daughter said, that is why. Because otherwise they wouldn't see that they had entered a different status, which I thought was very interesting. But no, they've become show business, and as I say, and fundraising activities. I regret to say, the modern wedding is really a travesty of everything it's supposed to be. You have people who will, when they're about to have a child, will put off the wedding so that you'll look better in the wedding dress. Rather, they used to marry quickly in order to give the child legitimacy. But I think one of the problems is, again, in the manners, that in a cohabiting situation, you cannot depend on its being permanent. And for that matter, in a marriage nowadays, people don't depend on its being permanent. So there is there's a sort of self-protective thing that comes in that is not a part of what I would consider real marriage, where you are a unit and everything is what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours, and you work for the betterment of the family. There isn't that kind of family identification, but I put it down not only to cohabitation, but to people whose parents were divorced, and they have a very clear sense that it is not a permanent situation. They better protect themselves.
Well, and many noted scholars say that's one of the reasons married women, even mothers, continue to work to the degree they do. They're worried that their marriage won't last, and they need to be financially.
And it's a realistic worry, because if the marriage doesn't last, I mean, that happened to a lot of women. The marriage didn't last, and suddenly it was his money. It wasn't our money anymore, and he walked off with it. So it's a realistic worry.
Now, in this context, weddings have become bigger and more expensive when you would think, well, if this is a more temporary...
Vulgar.
I won't go there. But as you would predict that there'd be a behavioral shift if marriages aren't necessarily going to last forever, that weddings would become a little less expensive or a little...
Wouldn't you think?
You would think.
Wouldn't you think? And you would also think that since people did not have to marry in order for the society to tolerate their living together, that they would be much more serious about it when they do get married, and therefore the divorce rate would go down. But it didn't. So I'm not a clairvoyant.
So here's the question, and I don't know the answer because I didn't see it in your writings, but maybe you've written about it. have the rules of etiquette about marriage changed because of our changing views of how permanent it is and of the investment people put in it?
Well, that's not a rule of etiquette to be frightened that your husband's going to leave you for a teenager.
No, but have the behavior changed? You're right.
That's the way the society has changed. But yes, I think people are a lot more protective and a lot less generous and a lot less identifying with the other people, with the other person, even with their children. I mean, you see people in schools who are, I'm important, parents, I'm important too, when it's the child who's performing or the child who's doing something. There is this kind of individual unit that does not lend itself as easily to the family unit.
Now that individual unit, some of it is shifting in a different direction. So there, for at least that heyday of the nuclear family of the 1950s, maybe it was 1954, June 1954 to January 1955. Maybe that's the only time it lasted, but it was there, and we talk about it with great nostalgia. But now I think it's more likely the case that the grandparents will be around, the mother's parents, and they live longer, but they're also they're more likely to be stable relatives of the child. Which is a kind of way throwback to the multi-generational family, which is an interesting concept. And this is happening. Now in the law, often grandparents are being given legal rights vis-a-vis their grandchildren, rights of visitation and so forth in the law. Do you see that in the beat you cover? I hear from grandparents who are devastated because they don't have that, because of the commonness of divorce, where usually the mother gets the children and the father's parents can be frozen out. And so the etiquette angle is be nice to the wife even if it's the ex-wife, because she's got control of the children most likely. That's not a bad rule all the time, is it? It's not a bad rule to have started from the beginning doing that, yes. In this work, this sense, and you've mentioned it now twice, about child rearing. And it does seem as if less time is being spent by the family unit. Let's not single out the women because it could be the men, but by the family unit taking care of the children or giving them guidance. What advice do you give? It's not just less time, and the less time is because the work day has gotten so long. It's the less will to do this. It's more of, and parents are, bless their hearts, usually mean well and they want the best for their children, but they think they turn decisions over to the children. They want them to be happy. They don't want to be negative about them. You can't do this and you can't do that. They want to be their friends. They want the little time that they can spend with them to be free of any instruction and so on. And so child rearing goes by the wayside. And it's the cruelest thing they can do to children because they don't prepare them from. When I started writing this column, I thought I would just hear from a few old cranks like myself saying, yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? And I found that most of the audience is young people. And they say, my parents just told me, oh, be yourself, do what you feel like. And they get out in the world and it doesn't work. And so they want to know, they see there are rules and there are reactions, they want to know what they are. And it seems as if nowhere is this a greater concern than among adolescents. They seem to be the ones that greatest loose ends. Because it suddenly hits them that they do care what other people think. Maybe not their parents, but they care what the person they're in love with thinks. They care what the college interviewer thinks of them, and so on. And they don't, this instruction, be yourself, what does that mean? Who else are you going to be, even if you wanted to be? It's the it's like sending a child out on the soccer field and saying, oh, just get the ball, don't worry, there are no rules, just, you get the ball. Be killed, right? You can't send children out in the world without telling them how the world works. We've been talking about changing family structures and marriages that don't last, and that, of course, includes divorce. In some respects, don't I, if I'm the custodial parent and I want to continue having a life and dating and so forth, don't I have an extra problem in this
Yes?
Yeah.
You have an extra problem.
What do I do about it?
Discretion, it's called. Discretion. You protect the children from your love life and from your problems, for that matter, from your most serious problems. One of the things that has happened in these situations is that the custodial parent tries to make an equal friend of the child and shares financial worries. What can the child do about it? Brings home dates which scare the children because they don't know how the structure may or may not change, and so on. And I think, I'm not saying that you don't have a life for yourself, but I'm saying you protect your children from having to wallow in it.
That can be quite difficult for any
Yes,
parent.
it is difficult.
And of course, it's the non-custodial parents that have the same issue.
Absolutely. It is difficult.
We've been talking about more global issues, but this kind of comes to a head in various of our ritual events, especially weddings, but it comes up in many different ways. How do I handle my father and his new girlfriend, or who do I invite to the wedding? And I don't want to ask you about all the specific rules and so forth because they're so wonderfully laid out in your book, but where is the future of those rituals that used to have a set pattern?
They didn't. Patterns have always changed. And most of those rituals you're talking about that we think went on from time immemorial were 19th century inventions in other countries. And they have been adapted and they change and so on. Because we have a fondness for the old, and yet we have to adapt it to modern circumstances. I'll give you an example. The brides have held on to this idea of the father giving them away, which was a concept. She lives under the protection of the father, and he's handing her over the protection of the husband. But she'd been living with the bridegroom for many years. She's probably earning more money than the father is. I mean, but they've hung on to that. But instead of understanding that the importance is the role, the parental role, a young woman who does not have a father will look around for any man rather to do the job rather than turn to the obvious person who brought her up, who's her mother. And that's an example of how things ought to adapt to the reality of modern times.
That's a wonderful thought. I don't think I've ever seen it in a wedding.
It's an old one, actually. There's a funny book novel by Edith Wharton called A Mother's Recompense, about a mother who has been away for many years, hasn't seen her child. She comes back. The daughter's getting married, and the father's dead. She wants the mother to give her away. It's a big Park Avenue wedding. It's the proper thing to do. The mother doesn't want to because the bridegroom is her former lover. Nobody knows it.
That's
so
a
it's
plot
been going
twist
on
I
for
was
a
not
while.
prepared for. Well, look, on that note, it is time to turn to our audience for questions. So could I ask those of you who have any questions to come up to the mic?
When you began the column, women's liberation was very much active and very much visible. Did you consider naming yourself Ms. Manners?
I did, as a matter of fact, and I used Miss because I wanted the traditional aspect of it, and I think Ms. is not a wonderful solution to a difficult problem of how you, and in the newspaper we always had to ask every woman, well, is it Miss or Mrs., and also Mrs. does not go with a woman's first name properly. Ms. is an excellent solution, and it's not a new one. I mean, it was used as an abbreviation for mistress, which was the title for both married and unmarried women, the respectable title, back in the 16th century. So I did think about it, but I thought, no, I want the traditional angle of this too.
I have a double-barrel question, if I might. The first part is an observation I'd like to know if you agree with, which is, it seems to me that there's a smaller quantity of manners now. There are fewer rules about what you're supposed to do to protect other people's sensitivities. Do you think that's a fair description?
The rules are there. There are fewer people obeying them.
And the second part is, can you imagine the circumstances under which that will change, that we will become a more formal society?
I can over the long run, because this is what has happened throughout history. Manners get more and more complicated until everybody is kind of hampered by them, and they say, oh, why can't we just be ourselves? Why can't we just behave naturally? This happened before the French Revolution, happened in the last century here. And then they do that, and suddenly everybody's saying everything they think and being natural, and people can't stand it. So they say, why can't we have some rules here? Why can't we have more etiquette? When I started writing this column, which was 1978, the very word etiquette had gone out of use. People say, oh, I mean, that's ridiculous. It's manners. We don't have any manners. And I'd say, well, you got that right, you know. But it has become a subject of interest, and nobody's more surprised than I am. And it's a reaction against, you know, people telling you that, going up to you and saying, you gotta tell you the truth, to which the answer should be no, please. You want me to be perfectly frank with you? No. It's a reaction to that kind of let it all hang out behavior that is taking us more back. And what scares me is that it could get, there's signs of it getting even more draconian when people think, well, they don't have faith in manners, so can we make laws about these things? And then you begin to infringe human rights. These should be in the area of etiquette.
Judith Martin, Miss Manners, thank you very much for being with us.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.